It's such a joy to be able to speak with you today about Duke Ellington's piece, The River. Just thinking about it brings back great memories from this past year. It's a piece that might not have that much name recognition in the orchestral world. Well, it's starting to get there though. I mean, it's been performed more often, for good reason. In the last few years, there's been more emphasis placed on rediscovering pieces by Black composers, and that can lead to, well, certainly multiple performances of them, but then more and more interpretations and observations, and then more and more recordings. And in the case of this piece, to finally get, now there's actually a new score and parts. So anybody that decides to perform this is going to have a much easier time of it than I did. But one thing I love about The River is I really feel like it is the feeling of jazz music and has lots of the strengths of that genre with the medium or the instrument of the orchestra. I think that Ellington is able to capture some of those different voices, and really I think also the idea of space. In jazz, the music creates these different spaces which allow for different experiences of time, so that you might get things that are very expansive.
Space is place, yeah, space is place.
Or things that are very in your face. In the well-known movement, the third movement of The River, where the river becomes giggling rapids, which it suggests some amount of fun. I think he basically treats the entire string section of the orchestra, well, save for the bass, which is part of the rhythm section in this piece. The rest of the strings are basically like a jazz solo instrument. Before we proceed further, I gotta issue this disclaimer that I've been using this word jazz already, which a lot of musicians don't like because they feel it limits them in some way. Just like some classical musicians, such as myself, might not always find the word classical to be very useful for us. This was the case for Duke, which is why I want to acknowledge that, and rather than thinking of himself as a jazz musician, he liked to think of himself as an American musician, that the things that he was doing and interested in were particularly American or representing an American experience. So for your enjoyment, I want to give you an opportunity to listen to him speak a little bit about his music. And this interview comes towards the end of his life. The River itself was composed just a few years before he passed. But in this interview, you can see somebody trying to get him to comment on labels such as jazz and just what sort of category he fits into, which, I mean, at this point in his life, he's been performing for 50 years and he's been around lots of late nights, and he's just not really, doesn't seem like he's interested in suffering fools at this point.
But you have the feeling the big guidelines, let's say, are the same?
What are the big guidelines? I didn't know there were any.
The main, the way you compose, the way you feel.
I didn't have any way. Are you telling me or asking me?
I'm asking you, sure.
Well, you sound like you have a diagram for me to stay in. You have a category, a cubic,
well,
pigeonhole.
Then get out of that.
Stay in that little bit?
No, please.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel.
I mean, if 20 years ago when you were composing, or if you are doing it now, do you have the same I don't know. He has the same guidelines, the same.
Well, I didn't know I had any guidelines. You just giving them to me. You never told me about it before. I never
Do
know
you
I had any
feel
guidelines.
the evolution of music has been important on what
The
you've
evolution
been?
of music generally has practically no meaning. If you're talking about me, then you talk about me. I don't know about anybody else. What I do has no relationship with what anybody else does. When people come to see us, they come to see us. And when you go to a Count Basie concert, everybody in that hall went to see Count Basie. They didn't go to any guidelines. Or when they went to see anybody, for that matter. That's what it is. No guidelines. I don't know what a guideline is all about. I mean, if this music that you're talking about, it means anything at all, it means freedom of expression.
So why might a masterful musician like Duke Ellington need or even just want an orchestrator? Well, in the 20th century, we can see in a lot of cases that having a collaborative process became just much more normal for creating music and helped some groups and in some genres create a lot of it. Duke wrote thousands of songs. Like in rock and roll, the Beatles, for example, I feel like Lennon and McCartney did their best work with the four of them, and those four guys contributing their ideas. It'd be pretty weird if they showed up with parts written out for George and Ringo to read very literally.
Well, if you're going to get technical about it.
And similarly for Duke and his orchestra, with a wonderful song of his, like Sophisticated Lady, I think it'd be pretty weird if he expected Harry Carney to play his solo as he saw it on a piece of paper. We can enjoy some of the freedom that's given through this process. So just a couple of years before Duke got this commission to write music for a ballet titled The River, the commission he got from Alvin Ailey and his American Ballet Theatre, Duke had the opportunity to collaborate a couple times with this Canadian musician, Ron Collier. He's a trombonist, and like Duke, had his own jazz orchestra that he had composed and arranged for on a number of occasions. And I guess Duke deduced that would be the best partnership for fleshing his music out into an orchestral setting. And I really feel like in the movement Lake, when the river broadens out and becomes this lake, that we can really appreciate the various colors and timbres that Ron finds in the orchestra. So we've looked at through how its diversity of moods and colors makes the river very unique as an orchestral experience. Harmonically speaking, with its chords, it's very typical of jazz music. With classical music, things were often built based on triad chords, where you have, and then you add a third, add another third, and then you get a three-note chord. Sometimes there would have been a fourth pitch in the chord, and then that would resolve back to the expected triad, or sometimes an unexpected one. In this music, which I feel like we can hear with The Lake is so voluptuous in a way, it's almost like the chords themselves are so beautiful and enjoyable that we don't need to or desire to depart them to other chords the way we might in other more common classical progressions of chords. Because rather than just those three, we might have something like...
That's a nice one.
We can just kind of settle into that and enjoy it before going on to something else. So I've done this thing where I'm going to play the end of the movement Lake, like we just heard, but let's reimagine it existing during the classical era where we have mostly triadic harmony that's available to us. So there we began and finished back at C with a C major triad. In his version of the melody, there's much more chromaticism.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
But even his first chord there, he stacked. So stacking these extra thirds, they're often called extension chords and are just very typical of jazz music. And even though it's in C major, he does finish in D flat. So many little aspects of it can sort of be adjusted. So instead of stacking that way, he ends up...
That's good.
It's almost like two major triads, or a certain type of stacked, and it's just each moment is quite something to savor. Back at the very beginning of this video, you heard the music from the movement titled Spring. So when the river begins, it starts to spring forth from the earth. So it's after the movement Spring that the river first starts to meander a little bit. And so the second movement, titled Meander, is really the first time when Ellington sets it off with lots of energy. The suite sort of tends to alternate between these beautiful soundscapes, as we first heard, and sort of every other one has like a good jazz feel and energy to it. Now, that's when it becomes really imperative that we have a collaborative approach and really learn what jazz music is, because just looking at the music is not going to lead to the sort of energy that we get in this Detroit Symphony recording. I mean, a lot of us know how we shouldn't be swinging. Yeah. And it's this great DSO recording that shows us how to swing.
That's right.
So what does it mean to produce a musical manuscript or to have documentation of it? Well, we have this wonderful recording we just heard, but before the 20th century, a manuscript meant that usually if it was a composer, they were going to have to carefully write down all of their ideas so that we, much later, or even just somewhere else in a different city, folks could follow their ideas as carefully as possible. So that was the case for composers in the 19th century, but then things began to change. We had Edison inventing the phonograph, and then much more similar to how some of us listen to music nowadays, especially all of those who are doing the vinyl thing, we had Berliner's incorporation of the gramophone company. where we had flat discs of music that people could purchase and listen to in their own home. And that really changed the game, because then you could start hearing things from far away. You could listen to them repeatedly as you please. And so for Ellington, he's writing music in a world where, in my opinion, like recordings are as much documentation as, well, if not more so of a documentation, really. They live on in posterity more than like a sketch that's been written down in many cases. I mean, I think of when I was in graduate school, they have a Beatles collection at Northwestern University, and there's this idea that documentation of their writing process or their music was just these words that were written down essentially on a scrap piece of paper.
Well, if you're going to get technical about it.
For Duke's music, I feel as though documenting it is not just limited to notation and recordings, but that the live experience of it is really an important part of what that music is.
And if you would like to be respectably cool, then tilt the left earlobe on the beat and snap the finger on the afterbeat there. Then you really don't care. And so by routining one's finger snapping and choreographing one's earlobe tilting, one discovers that one can become as cool as one wishes to be. With that, we certainly want to thank you for the wonderful way you've inspired us and remind you that you are very beautiful, very sweet, very gracious, very generous, and we do love you madly. Thank you.
So in a given city in the United States or even somewhere else around the world, between 1920 and 70, around 7 or 8 o'clock, you could go to an orchestra concert. And it was just when that was getting out that you could go somewhere and find the Duke Ellington Orchestra performing until like 1:30 or 2 a.m. And once folks, eventually get out of that experience, then Duke would enjoy having the hall quietly to himself, and it would be then maybe just starting at 2 a.m. that by himself on stage with the piano, he'd begin to compose. So quite an experience for him, and I think we can see that in many photos and videos of him that he looks kind of like a tired guy. I guess I've shown a couple examples of Duke in his later years as being tired or maybe impatient, but those were more of the exception, so I don't want to give that impression. He's a wonderful guy. So in the interest of balance, here he is in a more recent television show.
The secret is... listen.
Listen? That's the big secret?
When they speak, listen to the words they say. And for extra credit, retain the details and drop them in at a later date to prove you were listening.
Oh.
It's shockingly effective.
Despite all the effort that Ellington put into The River, unfortunately it wasn't quite completed. I mean, he did come up with 50 minutes of music, so there was a complete vision for the piece in terms of what he did at the piano and sent to the choreographer, but Bailey was able to do about half of the music, and that's what Collier orchestrated. So it wasn't quite Ellington's complete vision of this sort of cycle of water as a metaphor for the cycle of life. But maybe there are some pieces out there somewhere. When I got the score last year, it didn't include a complete orchestration for the movement Falls, but there has been an orchestra that's recorded that, and the new version does include that orchestration, so people can hear Ellington's vision of a waterfall. Maybe there's other stuff out there. We don't know. But regardless, this is one of my favorite musical experiences, and just an excellent, fortunate example of what the orchestra can do. And for me, it's quite a journey.